It's September 1565. A band of French soldiers, shipwrecked and exhausted, washes ashore on a Florida beach. They're starving, they've lost their weapons to the sea, and their hope is nearly gone. Then, through the dunes, they spot a familiar sight, the flag of a European nation. But it isn't their flag. As they get closer, a Spanish captain offers them food and safe passage home. But this offer comes with a question, a test of their faith that will decide who lives and who dies. These men don't know it yet, but a river is about to be named for their blood. This is the story of how a fight for empire and a clash of religions led to one of the most brutal massacres in American history, securing Florida for Spain and leaving a permanent scar on the land itself. In the mid-16th century, Europe was tearing itself apart over religion. In France, Protestants known as Huguenots were being heavily persecuted by the Catholic majority, so they looked to the New World for an escape, a place to practice their faith in peace. Backed by the influential French admiral Gaspard de Coligny, an expedition set sail. In 1564, a group of about 200 French colonists, mostly soldiers and artisans, led by René Goulin de Laudonnière, landed on the St. Johns River in modern-day Florida. There, they built a settlement, a triangular fort they called Fort Caroline. It was supposed to be a safe haven, a new beginning, but they had made one fatal mistake. In the eyes of the Spanish crown, all of La Florida, a huge territory covering much of the American Southeast, belonged to Spain. The French settlement wasn't just trespassing, it was an infestation of heretics right on the doorstep of Spain's growing New World empire. When news of Fort Caroline reached King Philip II of Spain, a monarch who saw himself as the chief defender of the Catholic faith, his reaction was absolute. He chose his most ruthless commander, Pedro Menéndez de Avilés, a man hardened by years of fighting pirates and foreign navies. His orders were simple: get to Florida, get rid of the French, and wipe out their heretical presence by any means necessary. In September 1565, Menéndez landed on the Florida coast. Just 35 miles or so south of the French fort, he founded his own settlement, naming it St. Augustine, the first permanent European city in what is now the United States. The stage was set. Two empires, two faiths, and two fiercely determined commanders were on a collision course, with a continent hanging in the balance. The French dream was about to turn into a nightmare. The tension didn't waste any time boiling over. Soon after Menéndez founded St. Augustine, a French fleet arrived from the homeland with reinforcements for Fort Caroline. Led by the experienced commander Jean Ribault, it brought over 600 fresh soldiers and settlers. The two fleets spotted each other almost immediately, and a short, messy naval battle broke out. The seas were too rough to fight effectively, so Ribault turned back to Fort Caroline, and Menéndez returned to St. Augustine to dig in. Now, Jean Ribault had a choice to make. He knew the Spanish were building a base just down the coast. He believed that one swift, decisive attack could wipe them out before they got a foothold. Against the advice of his officers, who warned him about the infamous September hurricane season, Ribault made his call. He loaded his best soldiers onto his ships and sailed south to attack St. Augustine. He was betting everything on a single strike. It was a gamble that would cost them all. Around the middle of September, just as Ribault's fleet was positioning itself for an attack, the sky went black. A massive hurricane ripped through the French ships, scattering them and smashing them to pieces against the coast. Hundreds of men, along with their weapons and supplies, were either lost at sea or washed up on desolate beaches south of St. Augustine. The French attack wasn't just stopped, it was completely destroyed by nature itself. For the Spanish, who were battered but safe in their new fort, it must have felt like a sign from God. Pedro Menéndez was as brilliant as he was brutal. He guessed the hurricane had wrecked the French fleet, which meant Fort Caroline was now virtually defenseless. While the storm was still blowing, he gathered between 300 and 500 of his own men and made an incredibly bold move. He would attack the French fort by land. For 3 days they marched north, hacking their way through flooded swamps and storm-ravaged forests. They arrived near Fort Caroline on September 19th, soaked and exhausted, but completely undetected. At dawn the next day, using the rain as cover, the Spanish attacked. The few defenders at Fort Caroline were taken by total surprise. It was over in minutes. The Spanish swarmed the fort, killing around 140 Frenchmen in the chaos. Menendez reportedly ordered that any prisoners be executed not as Frenchmen, but as heretics. Only about 50 women and children were spared, along with a few craftsmen whose skills were considered useful. A small group, including the fort's original commander, René de Laudonnière, managed to escape and eventually made it back to Europe. The French haven was now a Spanish fort, renamed San Mateo. But Menendez wasn't finished. Local Timucua tribes soon told him that groups of shipwrecked white men were stranded on the coast to the south, trapped by a wide inlet. These were the survivors of Jean Ribault's doomed fleet. Menendez marched his soldiers south to face them. What happened next was one of the most cold-blooded, methodical massacres of the colonial era. The first group of about 125 starving Frenchmen was cornered at the inlet. Menendez told them Fort Caroline had fallen and urged them to surrender, which they did. He then set a chilling plan in motion. He had the Frenchmen brought across the inlet 10 at a time, with their hands tied behind their backs. Once on the Spanish side, they were marched behind a sand dune out of sight. There, Spanish soldiers were waiting with swords. From this first group, over 100 were killed. Only about a dozen were spared, a few boys, artisans, and any who claimed to be Catholic. 2 weeks later, it happened again. Jean Ribault himself, along with his remaining 135 or so men, showed up at the same spot. Once more, Menendez offered them a chance to surrender. Defeated and out of options, Ribault and his men gave up. On October 12, 1565, they met the same fate. They were ferried across, tied up, and led behind the dunes to be executed. Later accounts, though perhaps exaggerated, claim that Menendez had Ribault's body dismembered and sent his head and beard to the Spanish king as proof the French leader was dead. In total, somewhere around 250 men were slaughtered on those beaches. From that day on, the inlet and the river that fed it would be known by a new, grim name: Matanzas, the Spanish word for slaughters. The massacre at Matanzas Inlet was a brutal act, but a strategically brilliant one. It was a decisive blow that effectively ended France's ambitions to colonize Florida, leaving the territory under Spanish control for most of the next 2 centuries. The controversy was immediate. While Spain celebrated a victory against heretics, others across Europe saw it as a dishonorable butchering of surrendered soldiers. But the story doesn't quite end there. In 1568, a French soldier named Dominique de Gourgues, a Catholic furious over the massacre of his countrymen, decided to get revenge. He sold his personal estate to fund an expedition and sailed back to Florida. He allied with the local Timucua tribe, who had come to despise the Spanish, and launched his own surprise attack on the Spanish-held Fort San Mateo, the former Fort Caroline. He took the fort and, in an act of chilling symmetry, executed his Spanish prisoners. A report claims he hung them with a sign that read, "Not as Spaniards, but as assassins." Gourgues burned the fort down and sailed back to France. He had his revenge, but he couldn't change the outcome. The French never again made a serious attempt to colonize Florida. Today, the site of this dark chapter in American history is marked by the Fort Matanzas National Monument. A small Spanish watchtower, built almost 200 years after the massacre, stands quiet guard over the river of slaughters. A nearby historical marker serves as a somber reminder of the events, noting that hundreds of French castaways were massacred here by the Spanish, giving the place its name. It's a permanent reminder of a time when the dream of a new world was often paid for with rivers of blood, and when your life could depend on the answer to a single, terrible question. What do you believe? The story of Matanzas Inlet is a stark example of the brutal realities that shaped the Americas. If you believe these forgotten histories deserve to be told, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell for more deep dives into the dramatic moments that history books often leave out. Let us know in the comments what other brutal New World stories you'd like to see covered. Thanks for watching.